Welcome to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Twin Labs, where we explore complex topics to help you become better informed and make sharper decisions using the power of AI and digital twins. Have you ever found yourself just completely stuck on a big decision, maybe buying a house or changing careers? You list all the pros, all the cons, trying to figure out the perfect rational choice.
Or the opposite. Maybe you've seen someone just, make a snap judgment, totally gut feel, and it works out brilliantly.
Exactly. We make decisions all the time, some tiny, some huge. But here's the thing that's always puzzled me. If there's supposedly a best way to decide, based on logic and all that, why do we so often seem to do something else entirely? Why doesn't our actual decision-making always line up with that perfect rational model?
That gap.
Yeah, that gap, that tension between the ideal way we think decisions should be made and how they actually happen in the real world, that's what we're diving deep into today. We're unpacking a really insightful set of sources, primarily looking at a core article from Twin Labs called Decision Theory vs. Decision-Making Theory, a comparative analysis.
Right.
And this material really digs into these two related but quite distinct ways of looking at decisions.
It really does. The sources draw a clear line. On one side, you've got decision theory. This is the more formal, often mathematical approach. It tries to prescribe the ideal way a rational person or agent should make a choice, especially when things are uncertain. It's about what you ought to do if you were perfectly logical.
Okay, the should and the other side.
That's decision-making theory. Now, this is largely descriptive. It's about observing, analyzing, and trying to explain how people actually make decisions out there in the messy real world. It looks at all the human stuff, our cognitive limits, biases, emotions, those mental shortcuts we take. Oh, okay, so the source uses this analogy, right?
Yeah.
Like the physics of how an ideal car should move on a frictionless plane versus studying how real drivers actually handle rush hour traffic. Getting cut off, dealing with road rage, maybe spilling coffee.
That's a perfect way to put it. And yeah, the source uses exactly that comparison. Decision theory is the physics of the ideal car. Decision-making theory is the study of the actual driver with all their habits and imperfections on a real road.
Got it.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to really unpack this source material. We want to clarify the distinctions between these two theories, trace their different histories, see how they eventually started talking to each other, understand why this difference matters. I mean, it impacts everything from AI design to government policy, and pull out the key takeaways for you, the listener, so you can better understand the decision processes happening all around us, and maybe even your own. All right, let's get into it. The material starts by highlighting something pretty important. How often these terms, decision theory and decision-making theory, are kind of used interchangeably, even though in serious technical discussions they mean quite different things.
Oh, absolutely. It's an easy mistake to make, right? They both have decision in the name. But if you're working in economics or AI or psychology or even management, getting that distinction clear is really crucial. Decision theory, it's formal, it's quantitative, its roots are deep in economics, mathematics, philosophy. It's focused on structure, logic, probability, utility.
So it's about building the rules for optimal thinking, like the absolute best way to do it.
Exactly. It's prescriptive. It sets out rules or axioms, fundamental assumptions, and says, look, if you follow these logical rules, you will arrive at the best possible outcome according to whatever goal you've set. Usually that goal is maximizing some kind of value or, more technically, utility.
Okay, prescribing the ideal. So what about decision-making theory then? Where does that come from?
That's where the psychologists, the cognitive scientists, the behavioral economists come into play. This side is about empirical observation, it asks. How do actual humans gather information? How do they process it, weigh their options, and finally make a choice? It's descriptive. It focuses on the cognitive machinery, the heuristics.
Heuristics, those are the mental shortcuts, right?
Precisely. Those rules of thumb we use because we just don't have the time or brain power to analyze everything perfectly. Decision-making theory studies those, plus the biases that often come with them, the role our emotions play, how the way a choice is framed or presented can influence us, all that real-world complexity.
So one is like the architect's blueprint for a perfect logical decision-making machine, and the other is more like a field biologist's notes on how real creatures actually behave in the wild.
That's a great way to think about it. Decision theory dictates what a decision maker should do to be perfectly rational and consistent. Decision-making theory describes what decision makers actually do, including all the predictable ways they stray from that perfect ideal.
And the source really hammers home why understanding this split is so critical, doesn't it? Why is it key across different fields?
Because if you confuse them, you end up with flawed analyses or ineffective designs. Imagine, say, building an AI system based purely on normative decision theory, assuming users will behave with perfect rationality.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster when it meets actual humans.
Exactly. Real users have biases, they use shortcuts, they get emotional, the AI just won't work as intended. Or think about designing a public health campaign assuming people will logically weigh all the costs and benefits, when actually they might be heavily influenced by how you frame the message or what their peers are doing. So whether you're in finance, marketing, policy, AI development, recognizing which lens you're using, normative or descriptive, is absolutely fundamental.
Okay, that makes total sense. Let's nail down the definitions then. The source emphasizes being precise here.
Absolutely. Precision is key. So the material defines decision theory, the normative one, as the mathematical economic framework that prescribes how rational agents should make choices, particularly when outcomes are uncertain. Its history goes way back. We're talking 17th century figures like Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat. They laid the groundwork for probability theory.
Which is essential for dealing with uncertainty logically.
Crucial. You can't make rational choices about uncertain futures without a way to handle probability. Then fast forward to the 18th century, 1738 specifically, Daniel Bernoulli comes along. He tackled some paradoxes around gambling and risk by introducing the idea of utility.
Utility. So not just the dollar amount, but how much it's worth to you.
Exactly, subjective value.
Yeah.
And critically, Bernoulli proposed diminishing marginal utility. The idea that, say, an extra $100 means a lot more to you if you're broke than if you're already a millionaire. That first slice of pizza is amazing, the 10th, maybe not so much.
The value of each additional unit goes down.
Right. This was a huge leap. It allowed for a formal way to think about how a rational agent would weigh risky options based on their personal value scale, their utility, not just the objective payoffs. So decision theory is deeply normative. It defines what consistent, preference-driven, utility-maximizing behavior should look like.
Okay, got the normative side. Mathematical, prescriptive, focused on the ideal rational agent maximizing utility. Now, how does the source define decision-making theory?
Decision-making theory, which you'll also hear called descriptive or behavioral decision theory, is defined as the field that characterizes how people actually make decisions. It emerged much later, drawing heavily from psychology, cognitive science, and management studies. Its aim isn't to lay down the law on how decisions should be made based on pure logic. It's to observe, explain, and build models of the reality of human choice.
And what kind of factors does it look at?
All the things that influence our real-world choices, the underlying cognitive processes, how we perceive information, how we remember things, how we reason, often imperfectly, the systematic biases we all tend to exhibit, the powerful role of emotions, and, as we mentioned, the reliance on heuristics, those simplifying mental shortcuts. Its foundation is empirical evidence.
Meaning experiments, observations.
Exactly. Running controlled experiments, conducting surveys, observing people making decisions in natural settings, building computational models that try to mimic human thought processes.
So if decision theory is built on logical axioms and math, decision-making theory is really built on data about actual behavior.
That's the core methodological split the material highlights. Normative decision theory uses deductive reasoning. You start with these fundamental axioms of rationality, like preferences should be stable and consistent, and you logically derive how a perfectly rational agent must behave to satisfy those axioms.
And descriptive.
Descriptive decision-making theory uses inductive reasoning. You observe human behavior, often through carefully designed experiments. You identify patterns, particularly where behavior deviates from those rational axioms. Then you try to build models, like prospect theory, that can explain and predict those observed patterns.
The source material uses a really helpful summary table to contrast these two across different aspects. Maybe we can walk through that quickly to kind of preview the differences.
Yeah, that table is a great snapshot. Let's look at the key dimensions. First, focus. Decision theory is all about the ideal rational models, how to make the optimal choice. Decision-making theory, it's focused squarely on real-world human behavior, what people actually do, warts and all.
Okay, then the approach. Decision theory is normative. Prescriptive, it tells you what you should do to be rational. Decision-making theory is primarily descriptive, explaining what happens. Although, interestingly, sometimes those descriptive insights can be used prescriptively to help people make better decisions given their limitations.
That's a key point about integration later. Then, methods. Very different toolkits. Decision theory uses math. Probability theory, logic, optimization. Decision-making theory leans on psychology, controlled experiments, cognitive modeling, empirical data collection.
And the domains of application, where do we see these theories used most?
They tend to show up in different places. Decision theory is foundational in AI when designing agents that need to act optimally, also in economics, finance, operations research for optimization problems. Decision-making theory is more prominent where understanding actual human action is key. Psychology, leadership studies, healthcare choices, consumer behavior, marketing.
Makes sense. Finally, the table mentions typical examples.
Right. For decision theory, think examples involving maximizing expected utility in a gamble, or using Bayesian logic to update beliefs based on new evidence. For decision-making theory, the classic examples are things like the heuristics availability, anchoring, representativeness, or framing effects, showing how simply changing the wording of a choice can alter behavior.
That summary really drives home how different these perspectives are. Why is starting with these precise definitions and distinctions so important for someone, maybe in business or tech, trying to apply these ideas?
Because muddying the waters leads to really practical problems. If you're building, say, a financial planning tool, or designing a user interface, or even crafting corporate strategy if you build it, assuming everyone is a perfectly rational econ from decision theory, but your users or employees are actually humans operating according to decision-making theory, well, your tool or strategy is likely to fail.
Right.
You need to be crystal clear about which set of assumptions you're working with. Are you setting an ideal benchmark, normative, or are you trying to predict or influence actual behavior, descriptive? A company like Twin Labs, operating in complex fields like healthcare or using AI for business decisions, absolutely has to grapple with this. They need the power of normative models, for sure, but they also have to ground their solutions in the reality of human decision-making.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's dig into the history. The source traces how these two traditions developed, and it's fascinating because they seem to have run on somewhat parallel tracks for a long time before really starting to interact.
Yes, the historical context is really illuminating. The normative tradition, decision theory, has the deeper historical roots. As we touched on, it goes back to those 17th and 18th century mathematicians thinking about probability.
Pascal and Fermat laying the groundwork.
Exactly. And then Bernoulli bringing in utility in 1738. That shift from just expected monetary value to expected utility value was absolutely fundamental. It allowed the theory to explain choices that seemed irrational purely based on money, like why people buy insurance, accepting a small, sure loss to avoid a large, uncertain one, or why they might turn down a gamble with a positive expected monetary payoff if they're risk-averse.
But the modern, really rigorous form of decision theory solidified in the 20th century, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The landmark event was the publication of Theory of Games and Economic Behavior in 1944 by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. This book provided a formal, mathematical, axiomatic foundation for expected utility theory, EUT.
What exactly does axiomatic foundation mean in this context, like basic logical rules?
Precisely. They laid out a set of fundamental axioms, basic assumptions about rational preferences. Things like preferences should be complete. You can compare any two options. They should be transitive. If you like A better than B and B better than C, you must like A better than C. And continuity. Small changes in probabilities shouldn't drastically flip your preferences. They then mathematically proved that if a decision-maker's preferences obey these seemingly simple logical axioms, then their choices can be represented as if they are maximizing the expected value of some underlying utility function.
Wow, so a mathematical proof connecting basic rationality rules to maximizing utility.
It was a monumental achievement. It provided this incredibly powerful, logically coherent framework for understanding rational choice under risk, where probabilities are known. Then, a decade later, Leonard Savage, in his 1954 book, The Foundations of Statistics, extended this. He developed the Subjective Expected Utility, SEU, model.
How did that extend EUT?
Savage tackled situations of uncertainty, where probabilities aren't objectively given, but are based on the decision-maker's personal subjective beliefs or degrees of confidence. He showed that even with subjective probabilities, if your preferences and beliefs satisfy certain consistency axioms, your choices can still be represented as maximizing expected utility. This von Neumann-Morgenstern-Savage framework became the bedrock of normative decision theory for decades.
Were there other key figures building on this normative ideal around the mid-20th century?
Oh, yes. You have people like Kenneth Arrow looking at the challenges of aggregating individual rational preferences into a rational group decision. His famous impossibility theorem highlighted major difficulties there. And then Howard Raifa, starting in the 1960s, was incredibly influential in developing practical methods for decision analysis.
Decision analysis, is that about applying the theory?
Exactly. Raifa, often working with Ralph Keeney later on, developed tools and techniques to help real people make decisions that were more systematic and closer to the normative ideal. Think decision trees, methods for eliciting someone's utility function for different outcomes, ways to handle decisions with multiple conflicting objectives. It was about taking the elegant normative theory and making it usable for complex real-world problems.
Okay, so this tradition built up this really impressive logical structure for the ideal rational decision maker. But as you mentioned, running alongside this, people were starting to notice, well, that real humans didn't always seem to follow these beautiful rules.
Precisely. That's where the descriptive tradition, decision-making theory, really takes off. Even as EUT was being perfected, there were researchers, particularly outside of pure economics, questioning whether it actually described how people behave. And the towering figure here, early on, is Herbert A. Simon.
Simon, he's famous for bounded rationality, right?
Exactly. His 1947 book, Administrative Behavior, was groundbreaking. Simon argued very powerfully that the hyper-rational Homo economicus assumed in EUT was just not realistic. Real decision-makers, he said, operate under significant constraints. We don't have perfect information. We often have very limited, incomplete data. We have finite cognitive abilities, limited memory, limited attention, limited processing power, and we have limited time. Our rationality is fundamentally bounded by these realities.
So if we're not optimizing perfectly due to these bounds, what did Simon say we do instead?
We satisfice. It's a blend of satisfy and suffice. Instead of going through the incredibly demanding process of finding all possible options, evaluating them exhaustively, and picking the absolute single best one, optimizing, Simon observed that people typically search for options until they find one that is good enough, one that meets their minimum acceptable criteria or aspiration level. Once they find a satisfactory option, they often stop searching.
Like choosing the first decent-looking restaurant when you're hungry, rather than checking the reviews for every single place in town.
Exactly like that. His administrative model described how managers and organizations actually make decisions, often sequentially, using simplified rules and procedures, aiming for satisfactory outcomes rather than theoretical optima.
And this idea of bounded rationality and satisficing had a big impact on how people thought about organizations.
Immense impact. Scholars like James March, working with Simon and others, studied how decisions really get made in complex organizations. They developed models like the garbage can model, which portrays organizational decision-making as a somewhat messy process where problems, potential solutions, participants, and choice opportunities kind of bump into each other, rather than following a neat, linear, rational path.
Okay, so Simon provided this conceptual alternative. Then came the experimental work challenging EUT directly.
Yes. Starting around the 1950s and continuing into the 60s and 70s, psychologists and some economists began designing clever experiments specifically to test whether people's choices actually followed the axioms of expected utility theory. And they consistently found systematic violations.
What were some of the famous findings? The source mentions a couple of paradoxes.
Two really big ones were the Allais paradox, published by Maurice Allais in 1953, and the Ellsberg paradox from Daniel Ellsberg in 1961. Allais showed that people's choices between gambles could violate EUT's independence axiom, basically, how you weigh common outcomes, especially when certainty was involved. People seem to value certainty more than EUT predicted.
And Ellsberg.
Ellsberg demonstrated what's called ambiguity aversion. People tend to prefer risks where the probabilities are known, like drawing from an urn with 50 red and 50 black balls, over risks where the probabilities are unknown or ambiguous, like drawing from an urn where you don't know the proportion of red and black balls, even if the potential payoffs are the same. This violates the SEU idea that people should form subjective probabilities and act on them consistently. These weren't just random errors. They were predictable patterns of deviation from the normative model.
So the empirical evidence was mounting that EUT wasn't a great description of reality. And then came the researchers often credited with really crystallizing this behavioral approach, Tversky and Kahneman.
Absolutely. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, working together from the late 1960s through the 70s and beyond, were psychologists who brought incredible experimental rigor to documenting how people deviate from normative rationality. Their 1974 paper on heuristics and biases was a bombshell.
What did it show?
They demonstrated that people systematically rely on a limited number of mental shortcuts or heuristics to make judgments under uncertainty. Things like the availability heuristic, judging the frequency or probability of an event based on how easily examples spring to mind, or representativeness, judging probability based on how similar something is to a stereotype, or anchoring and adjustment, starting with an initial value, the anchor, and adjusting, but usually insufficiently. These heuristics are often efficient, but they lead to predictable systematic errors or biases in judgment.
And they didn't stop there. They developed prospect theory.
Right. Their most celebrated contribution, published in 1979, was prospect theory. This wasn't just about judgment. It was a full-fledged descriptive theory of choice under risk, specifically designed to account for the experimental anomalies like the Allais paradox and other observed behaviors that UTT couldn't explain.
What were the key innovations in prospect theory?
Several crucial ones. First, outcomes are evaluated not in terms of absolute final wealth, like in EUT, but as gains or losses relative to a reference point, often the current status quo. Second, the theory incorporates loss aversion.
That's the idea that losses hurt more than equivalent gains feel good. Like losing $100 feels worse than finding $100 feels good.
Exactly. The pain of a loss is psychologically more powerful than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Prospect theory captures this with a value function that is steeper for losses than for gains. It also includes a probability weighting function, showing that people tend to overweight small probabilities, like lottery chances, and underweight moderate to high probabilities. This whole structure provided a much, much better fit to how people actually made choices in experiments involving risk.
And the source mentions that this had a huge impact, saying it became widely accepted that EUT, while normatively appealing, was simply a false descriptive hypothesis.
That quote really captures the shift. Tversky and Kahneman's work didn't necessarily kill EUT as a normative benchmark or a tool for prescribing rational action, but it fundamentally undermined its claim to be an accurate description of human behavior. This really paved the way for the entire field of behavioral economics and cemented behavioral decision research as a major force. Kahneman winning the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for this work, even though he's a psychologist, really signaled its mainstream acceptance.
It's a really fascinating story of these two parallel streams, one building this elegant mathematical ideal, the other chipping away at its descriptive accuracy with real-world data. To help us keep track of this journey, maybe we could quickly recap the key names and milestones the source lays out in its timeline.
Sure, a quick run through. Back in the 17th, 18th centuries, you have Pascal and Fermat laying the mathematical foundations for probability. Then Daniel Bernoulli, 1738, introduces the crucial concepts of utility and diminishing marginal utility. The big formalization comes with von Neumann and Morgenstern, 1944, and their expected utility theory, EUT. Almost immediately, Herbert Simon, starting around 1947, challenges the rationality assumption with bounded rationality and satisficing. Leonard Savage, 1954, extends EUT to subjective probabilities with subjective expected utility, SEU. Then the empirical challenges mount. Maurice Allais, 1953, with his paradox, and Daniel Ellsberg, 1961, with the ambiguity paradox. Then the empirical challenges mount. Around the same time, Howard Riefe, starting late 1960s, develops practical decision analysis tools based on normative theory. Then the game changers. Tversky and Kahneman published their work on heuristics and biases, 1974, and then prospect theory, 1979. Then the game changers. Daniel Kahneman gets the Nobel in 2002, recognizing the impact of integrating psychology into economics. Then the game changers. And this leads into all the contemporary work we see today, behavioral economics. Books like Thaler, Sunstein, cognitive neuroscience, AI research drawing on both traditions.
That timeline really clarifies the distinct evolution and the key moments where the descriptive view started to gain serious traction against the purely normative one. Understanding this history definitely helps explain why we have these two different perspectives today and why their relationship is so important.
It really sets the stage for understanding the comparisons and integrations that followed.
Okay, so let's dive deeper now into that comparative analysis the source provides. We've touched on the core differences, but let's flesh out how these two theories really stack up when you look closely at their objectives, methods, applications, and especially their assumptions about rationality.
Right, let's elaborate on those dimensions from the summary table. First, objectives. The objective of normative decision theory is fundamentally prescriptive. It wants to answer the question. Given a set of preferences and beliefs and the rules of logic and probability, what should a decision maker choose to maximize their expected utility? It aims to identify the single, objectively best choice according to the axioms of rationality.
And the descriptive objective is different.
Completely different focus. Decision-making theory's objective is to describe and explain. It asks, what do people actually do when faced with a decision? It seeks to build models that can predict real human behavior, even, or especially, when that behavior deviates from the perfectly rational ideal. It catalogs those deviations, like framing effects or loss aversion, and tries to understand the underlying cognitive processes. So EUT predicts choices aiming for logical optimality. Prospect theory predicts choices aiming to match observed human patterns.
Okay, clear difference in goals. What about the methodologies? We said one uses math, the other psychology, but can we elaborate?
Sure, normative approaches are defined by their reliance on formal methods. Think mathematical proofs, axiomatic reasoning, probability theory, optimization techniques, utility functions, Bayesian inference, game theory. The source notes that classic normative works tend to be abstract and deductive. You start with first principles, the axioms of rationality, and logically derive how an ideal agent must behave.
And descriptive methods are more grounded in observation.
Exactly. They are fundamentally empirical and often draw heavily from psychology. The toolkit includes controlled laboratory experiments like the ones Tversky and Kahneman famously ran, presenting people with hypothetical choices. It also includes surveys, observational studies of decisions in the real world, cognitive modeling, trying to simulate thought processes, and case studies. The goal is always to test theoretical models against actual human data. As the source emphasizes, it was the persistent findings from these lab experiments showing systematic violations of EUT axioms that directly motivated the development of alternative descriptive models like prospect theory. So yes, normative is primarily mathematical and prescriptive, descriptive is primarily empirical and interpretive.
The domains of application also seem to reflect this split quite clearly.
They do, traditionally at least. Normative decision theory has been most influential in fields where modeling optimal behavior or designing optimal systems is central. Economics, with its core model of the rational agent, Homo economicus. Finance, for things like portfolio optimization theory. Operations research, dealing with complex planning and resource allocation problems. And importantly, in artificial intelligence, especially in designing agents that need to act optimally according to some goal-think game planning AI, robot path planning, or systems using Markov decision processes to learn optimal policies based on expected rewards. It's the go-to framework when you want to build an ideal rational system or analyze behavior as if it were rational.
And descriptive theory finds its home where understanding actual human behavior is the main goal.
Precisely. Psychology is the obvious one. Behavioral economics, which is built on integrating psychological realism into economic models. Management science, looking at how managers and teams really make decisions within organizations. Public policy, trying to understand why citizens make certain choices about health, savings, energy use, and how to influence those choices effectively. Marketing and consumer behavior research, naturally. The source points out this division. Normative models often excel in highly technical domains like AI planning or engineering design, while descriptive models are indispensable in fields concerned with human action like leadership development, healthcare adherence, or designing user-friendly products. And this is where understanding both becomes critical for organizations like Twin Labs, which operate at the intersection, applying decision science concepts in fields like economics and healthcare, but also building AI tools. They need the normative framework for optimization, but must ground it in descriptive reality for it to be effective.
That makes sense. Now let's tackle the really big one, the core assumptions about rationality. This feels like the deepest fault line between the two.
It absolutely is. It's the philosophical bedrock. Normative theory, especially classical UTUU, makes very strong assumptions about rationality. It posits an idealized agent, sometimes called Homo economicus, who possesses perfectly consistent preferences across all possible outcomes, complete knowledge of all relevant information and options, unlimited computational power to process this information, and the unwavering goal of maximizing their expected utility. It's a model of perfect logical consistency and computational prowess.
Which sounds pretty demanding. Not exactly how my brain feels on a Monday morning.
Right. And that's exactly where descriptive theory, following Simon's lead, diverges. It starts from the premise of bounded rationality. Real humans face significant limitations. Our information is often incomplete, ambiguous, or costly to acquire. Our preferences can be fuzzy, context-dependent, or even inconsistent over time. We have finite cognitive resources, limited attention spans, fallible memories, restricted processing capacity, and we operate under time pressure. Therefore, descriptive models assume we don't and can't optimize in the way normative theory prescribes. Instead, we satisfice. We use simplified strategies, heuristics, to make decisions that are good enough rather than exhaustively searching for the absolute best. The source highlights Simon's quote about replacing global rationality with behavior that's compatible with the access to information and the computational capacities that organisms actually possess. And it points to Kahneman and Tversky's work demonstrating how profoundly things like framing, how a choice is presented, and reference points, our starting point for evaluating gains and losses, influence our decisions, leading to systematic violations of the strict EUT axioms when you actually test people. These aren't just minor quirks, they represent a fundamentally different way of operating compared to the idealized normative agent.
It's crystal clear now. These are two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world of decisions. One starts with logic and math to build the ideal. The other starts with observation and psychology to map the reality.
Exactly. And recognizing that fundamental difference is the first step to understanding why they sometimes clash, but also why integrating them can be so powerful.
Okay, theory is one thing, but examples really make it click. The source provides several really clear illustrations that highlight this contrast between the normative ideal and the descriptive reality. Let's walk through some of those.
Yes, the examples are very helpful. The first one contrasts utility maximization, normative, with prospect theory, descriptive, often using a classic financial gamble scenario.
Can you set up a typical example?
Sure. Imagine someone offers you a choice. Option A is a guaranteed $50 gain. Option B is a gamble with a 50% chance of winning $100 and a 50% chance of winning nothing. Both have the same expected monetary value, $50. How should you choose? Normative expected utility theory says you should calculate the expected utility of each option based on your personal utility function for money. If you have diminishing marginal utility for gains, a standard assumption, the utility of the sure $50 might actually be higher than the average utility of the $0 and $100 outcomes in the gamble. So EUT would often predict a rational, risk-averse person would choose the sure $50.
Prospect theory suggests people might behave differently, especially depending on how it's framed.
Precisely. Prospect theory, being descriptive, models observed behavior. In the domain of gains, like this example, it generally agrees with EUT's prediction of risk aversion. Most people do prefer the sure $50. The value function for gains is concave, similar to utility. However, prospect theory really shines when you flip it to the domain of losses. Imagine the choices between a sure loss of $50, option C, versus a 50% chance of losing $100 and a 50% chance of losing nothing, option D.
Same expected monetary value again, negative $50. What does prospect theory predict here?
Here's where loss aversion and the shape of the value function for losses, which is convex, kick in. Because losses loom larger than gains, and because people are often risk-seeking when trying to avoid losses, prospect theory predicts many people will choose the gamble, option D, taking the risk of losing $100 for the chance to lose nothing over accepting the sure loss of $50. This risk-seeking behavior in the loss domain directly contradicts the typical risk aversion predicted by EUT in the gain domain. And again, the source explicitly mentions that Kahneman and Tversky's findings showed prospect theory fit the data better, leading to EUT being seen as descriptively false even if normatively important.
Wow, so just framing it as a loss instead of a gain can completely reverse the typical preference, directly contradicting the simple EUT prediction.
Exactly. It highlights the power of reference points and loss aversion. Another great example the source uses is optimization versus satisficing. The classical normative decision model assumes optimization. You identify all possible alternatives, meticulously evaluate the consequences of each one against your goals, and then select the single alternative that yields the absolute maximum value or utility.
Which sounds exhausting, frankly.
Right.
Simon said that's not what happens in real organizations.
Right. Simon's descriptive model of administrative behavior posits satisficing. He observed that managers, faced with complex problems and limited resources, don't optimize. Instead, they set an aspiration level, a definition of good enough. They then search through potential solutions sequentially, evaluating them one by one. As soon as they find an option that meets their aspiration level, they often stop searching and choose that one. The source gives the example of a hiring committee.
How does that work?
Instead of interviewing, say, 20 candidates, painstakingly ranking every single one on multiple criteria, and then offering the job to the mathematically determined best optimization, a real hiring committee might interview candidates sequentially. They have a set of criteria in mind, must have X years of experience, needs Y skill, seems like a good team fit. The first candidate they interview who meets all these good enough criteria gets the offer. They satisfice. It's much less cognitively demanding, much faster, even if it doesn't guarantee finding the absolute single best possible hire out of the entire pool.
That definitely sounds familiar from real-world experience. What about the third example? Decision analysis versus heuristic policies in finance.
Okay, so on the normative side, in finance, you have sophisticated techniques rooted in decision analysis and optimization. Think of Harry Markovitz's mean variance portfolio theory, which won him a Nobel. It's a mathematical framework for constructing an investment portfolio that provides the highest possible expected return for a given level of risk, or the lowest possible risk for a given level of expected return. It finds the efficient frontier using optimization, pure normative thinking.
But that's not how most individual investors pick stocks, is it?
Often, no. Descriptive research, looking at how individual investors actually behave, finds they frequently rely on much simpler rules of thumb or heuristics. Maybe they use a simple 1N rule, dividing money equally among available options. Maybe they overinvest in stocks of companies they're familiar with, familiarity bias, or in their own company's stock. They also exhibit well-documented biases like the disposition effect, the tendency to sell winning stocks too quickly to lock in the gain, but hold on to losing stocks too long, hoping they'll recover because realizing the loss is painful. This is directly linked to the loss aversion captured by prospect theory. So you have the normative ideal of calculated optimization versus the descriptive reality of heuristics and biases.
And the last example really brings it into the realm of public policy. Rational planning versus nudges.
This is a fantastic illustration of how understanding the descriptive side can lead to better policy. A traditional, normatively inspired approach to policy often assumes citizens are rational calculators. For example, if you want people to save more for retirement, you might just provide them with lots of information about different savings plans and contribution options, assuming they will analyze it all and choose the plan that optimizes their long-term financial well-being. The policy relies on active, rational choice.
But we know people often don't do that. Inertia is powerful.
Exactly. Behavioral research highlights strong tendencies like status quo bias or default bias. People tend to stick with whatever the default option is, often due to inertia, complexity, or procrastination. Recognizing this descriptive reality led behavioral economists like Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein to champion the idea of nudges.
Nudges, subtly changing the choice environment.
Precisely. Instead of just providing information and expecting rational optimization, a nudge changes the choice architecture to make the desired behavior easier or the default option. The classic example is automatic enrollment in retirement savings plans. Instead of requiring employees to actively opt in to saving, which many fail to do, companies set the default to automatically enroll employees, while still giving them the freedom to opt out if they choose. This simple change in the default, leveraging inertia, dramatically increases participation rates. It's using a descriptive insight about human behavior, default bias, to achieve a normatively desirable outcome, more retirement saving.
These examples are incredibly clear. They really show the stark contrast between the prescriptive based on logic and the descriptive what actually happens based on psychology.
But they underline why understanding both is crucial for designing things, whether it's financial products or public policies that actually work in the real world.
So we've established these two are distinct traditions with different goals, methods, and assumptions. But are they totally separate silos? The source suggests there's actually a lot of interaction and integration happening now.
That's right. While they have distinct origins and core identities, the lines have become increasingly blurred, and there's a strong trend towards integration. They aren't isolated islands anymore. They're informing each other in really productive ways.
How is that integration taking shape? What are some examples?
Well, one major area is the field often explicitly called behavioral decision theory or behavioral decision research. This field intentionally bridges the gap. It acknowledges the importance of normative standards, what constitutes a good decision, but it heavily incorporates empirical findings from psychology about how people actually think and choose. Its goal is often prescriptive in a different sense, not just defining the ideal, but figuring out how to help real, boundedly rational people make better decisions, given their cognitive tendencies.
So using the descriptive knowledge to create better prescriptive advice.
Exactly. Think about designing decision aids or training programs that specifically target known biases or teach people better heuristics. Another related area is prescriptive decision theory itself evolving. Modern prescriptive approaches are increasingly incorporating behavioral insights. For instance, when recommending policies or strategies, analysts might try to anticipate how real people with their biases will react, rather than just assuming perfectly rational responses. The optimal theoretical policy might not be the optimal practical policy if people won't follow it predictably.
And you mentioned AI and machine learning earlier. as a key area for this blending.
Absolutely. AI is a hotbed of this integration. The source explicitly talks about a normative, descriptive, prescriptive framework becoming more common in AI decision support. Machine learning algorithms are incredibly powerful tools for analyzing vast amounts of data on actual human behavior. That's the descriptive input. They can learn patterns, predict choices, even estimate underlying preferences or utilities from that messy real-world data.
So AI can take the what people actually do data and use it to help them get closer to the what they should do ideal.
That's a key potential. The source quotes Rafa Fabetsky making exactly this point. AI and ML tools can assist managers, for instance, by providing better estimates of the expected utility of the alternatives based on analyzing complex data. By improving the inputs and analysis available to the human decision maker, AI can help make the overall process closer to the normative approach. This is precisely the kind of synergy Twin Labs aims for, using AI and sophisticated models like digital twins to analyze real-world complexity, descriptive, and provide insights or automated actions that align better with optimal outcomes, normative.
So AI isn't just about building purely rational agents anymore. It's also about understanding and augmenting boundedly rational humans.
Increasingly, yes. You also see this integration clearly in behavioral economics. It retains the core utility maximization framework from normative economics as a starting point, but it systematically modifies it by incorporating psychologically realistic factors like loss aversion, reference dependence, present bias, hyperbolic discounting, and fairness concerns. It's a direct blend.
Are other scientific fields contributing to this integration?
Definitely. Cognitive neuroscience and neuroeconomics are trying to find the biological basis for decision-making by combining brain imaging techniques, like fMRI, with tasks drawn from both normative and descriptive decision research. They hope to build unified models that explain both rational computation and systematic biases at the neural level. And even within AI, you see systems being designed that explicitly incorporate psychology-inspired heuristics or build hybrid models combining optimal control methods with learned models of human preferences or limitations. The big picture here, as the source suggests, is a move away from a strict dichotomy. Many modern frameworks use rational choice theory as a benchmark or scaffolding, but then adjust, parameterize, or augment it based on empirical insights about actual human behavior. It's about achieving a synthesis combining the rigor of the normative tradition with the realism of the descriptive one.
Which brings us to the so what question. Why does understanding this distinction and this trend towards integration actually matter? The source details some pretty significant implications for different groups.
Oh, it matters immensely. For researchers in any field touching on decision-making, getting this distinction right is fundamental. It forces clarity. Is your model intended to prescribe an ideal, normative, or explain reality, descriptive? The gap between the two explains why purely mathematical models built on strict rationality can fail spectacularly when tested empirically, and why purely descriptive models, while capturing behavior, might lack the power to guide improvement. This tension fuels integrative research, using behavioral experiments to test normative axioms, using normative benchmarks to identify behavioral anomalies, trying to reconcile the two.
And for policymakers, the implications seem incredibly direct and practical.
Absolutely critical. If policymakers operate under the assumption of perfect normative rationality, they'll design policies based solely on incentives and information provision, expecting people to calculate and comply optimally. But if people are boundedly rational, prone to biases, and heavily influenced by defaults or framing, those policies might completely miss the mark or even backfire. The rise of nudges is direct evidence of policymakers embracing descriptive insights. They now actively use knowledge about cognitive biases to design choice environments, think automatic enrollment, simplified forms, clear social norm messaging, salient warnings that gently steer people towards better outcomes, acknowledging and sometimes even leveraging psychological tendencies. The source warns that ignoring the descriptive side can lead to major policy failures, like overestimating savings rates or compliance with regulations.
So policy design has to be grounded in psychological reality, not just economic ideals.
It has to be. And the same applies to AI designers. This distinction is crucial for them, too. Traditional AI planning or game theory often relies heavily on normative models, designing algorithms to find a mathematically optimal strategy or maximize an expected reward function. That's fine for well-defined closed systems.
But AI increasingly interacts with messy humans.
Exactly. When you're designing human-centric AI things like recommendation systems, personalized learning platforms, AI assistants, collaborative robots, you absolutely must account for the fact that the human user is not a perfectly rational agent. They are boundedly rational. This means AI designers might need to present information in ways that mitigate known framing effects, build models to predict and adapt to user biases, perhaps even incorporate human-like heuristics into the AI itself to make interactions smoother or more intuitive. And as the source points out again, AML tools can play a crucial role here. By analyzing user data, these tools can help bridge the gap, making the combined human AI system perform closer to the normative ideal than the human could alone. This is a core challenge that companies like Twin Labs tackle. Building AI and digital twin systems that are not only technically optimal, but also effectively integrate with and enhance human capabilities, understanding both the system dynamics and the human element. AI design today requires fluency in both normative optimization and descriptive human behavior, and there's an even deeper overarching implication the material touches on: the role of value judgments. Normative models inherently embed values about what constitutes rationality or optimality. Descriptive models reveal the patterns and inconsistencies in how humans actually pursue their values, including systematic errors. Recognizing this distinction highlights that decision science isn't purely objective. It involves choices about what goals are important and how to measure success. Both perspectives are needed for a complete picture.
That's a really profound point. It's not just about the I's and the ought, but also about the values embedded in defining the ought.
Precisely. And acknowledging that complexity is vital as these fields move forward.
Speaking of moving forward, where's it all headed? The source outlines several exciting future directions where research is actively trying to bridge these normative and descriptive traditions even further.
It's definitely a vibrant area. One key direction is the continued development of behavioral decision support systems. This means building more sophisticated tools, maybe software, maybe training methods that explicitly integrate normative models, what's the optimal choice, with behavioral data, what mistakes are people likely to make. The goal is to design interventions like visualizations that counteract framing effects or checklists that mitigate planning fallacies that help users make choices closer to the normative ideal because the system understands their likely descriptive tendencies.
So smarter tools designed specifically for our cognitive quirks.
Exactly. Another important frontier is computational rationality. This is about trying to formalize the idea of bounded rationality itself. Instead of just saying people are limited, researchers are developing computational models where agents are trying to be rational within their resource constraints, like limited time or processing power. This might involve modeling the trade-off between the cost of thinking more versus the benefit of a slightly better decision, potentially providing a deeper, more principled explanation for why we use heuristics.
And how does AI fit into the future picture here?
AI remains central. We're seeing advancements in generative AI and reinforcement learning that are trying to incorporate more human-like reasoning patterns, including heuristics, not just pure optimization. There's also inverse reinforcement learning, which tries to work backward, observe potentially biased human behavior, and infer the underlying goals or reward functions the person might actually be pursuing, even if imperfectly. This helps AI understand human intent better. Hybrid AI architectures that combine the strengths of normative optimization with learned models of human behavior are also a major research thrust.
What about connecting to the brain?
Neuroeconomics is pushing forward, using increasingly sophisticated brain imaging and stimulation techniques combined with decision tasks to unravel the neural circuits underlying both rational calculation and biased choices. The hope is to eventually ground decision theories in biological mechanisms.
And ethics seems increasingly important, especially with AI's role expanding.
Absolutely. A critical future direction involves integrating normative ethical objectives, principles of fairness, accountability, transparency, well-being, with empirical data on human moral intuitions and ethical decision-making. This is vital for developing AI systems that are aligned with human values and for designing policies that are both effective and just. Finally, the source mentions the rise of big data decision analysis. This involves using modern machine learning and data analytics techniques on massive datasets to enhance or even replace parts of traditional decision models. Frameworks like DACAS, data-driven expected cost-sensitive active sampling, mentioned in the source, aim to blend statistical learning from data descriptive with optimization algorithms, normative, in new ways. The overall trajectory, as the source suggests, seems clear, moving beyond a strict either-or between normative and descriptive. The future likely lies in developing sophisticated hybrid frameworks. These frameworks will probably retain a normative core aiming for rational goals or optimal outcomes, but they will be deeply informed, calibrated, and perhaps even dynamically adjusted based on empirical data and robust models of actual human cognition and behavior. The synthesis of mathematical rigor and psychological realism is seen as the key to tackling the truly complex decision problems we face, especially in areas involving complex systems interacting with humans, precisely the domain where Twin Labs focuses its efforts with AI and digital twins.
That brings us towards the end of this really fascinating deep dive into decision theory versus decision-making theory.
Yeah.
To wrap things up, what would you say are the absolute essential takeaways from all this material that you want our listeners to hold on to?
I think the most crucial thing is simply recognizing that fundamental difference, the difference between decision theory, which provides the benchmark, the ideal of perfect rational choice, often
Yes.
using math and logic,
The shut.
right, the should, and decision-making theory, which describes the reality, the isses, of how humans, with our bounded rationality, our heuristics, our biases, actually make choices based on psychological observation and experiment.
And we trace their very different historical paths, one evolving from probability and economics towards EUT and SCU, the other emerging from psychology and management studies, challenging that ideal with concepts like bounded rationality and findings like prospect theory, thanks to figures like Simon, Tversky, and Kahneman.
Exactly. They differ fundamentally in their core objectives, prescribe versus describe, their methodologies, math logic versus psychology experiments, their primary domains of application, optimal systems versus human behavior, and most importantly, their assumptions about rationality, idealized versus bounded.
The examples made this crystal clear, the difference in predicting choices and gambles, utility versus prospect, the reality of satisficing versus optimizing in hiring, the contrast between sophisticated portfolio analysis and common investor heuristics, and how understanding defaults led to policy nudges.
And critically, despite their differences, they're not isolated anymore. We see this growing integration where insights from both are being combined, especially with the help of AI and big data, to build more realistic and effective models, decision aids, and policies.
And understanding this whole picture, the distinction, the history, the integration, has very real consequences for researchers trying to build accurate models, for policymakers aiming for effective interventions, and definitely for AI designers creating systems that need to work seamlessly and productively with human users. So having explored this landscape, this fascinating territory between the ideal and the real in how decisions get made, what final thought or provocation based on the source material should we leave our listeners mulling over?
A final thought. I think the source material leaves us with this interesting tension. Even as our technology, especially AI, gets incredibly powerful at achieving the kind of complex optimization envisioned by normative decision theory, the key to making it truly effective might lie in how well it understands and accommodates the principles of descriptive decision-making theory. Perhaps the future of truly better decisions isn't just about creating perfectly rational algorithms in isolation, but about designing systems like those Twin Labs explores that genuinely comprehend our human complexities, our bounded rationality, and collaborate with us, augmenting our strengths while mitigating our weaknesses. The synergy might be where the real progress lies.
That's a really powerful thought to end on the future, is maybe in that collaboration between the rational ideal and the human reality. Thank you for joining us today. Visit the Twin Labs website for more business insights.